And welcome everybody to another edition of Historical Geocaching on the Road with geocacher Tina Photobug from Chattanooga, Tennessee, currently travel caching in Michigan. Today is very, very exciting because my family and I are headed to Battle Creek, Michigan to visit the Historic Adventist Village. I'm a Seventh-Day Adventist, and as the Adventist Church was being organized in the 1860s, they made their headquarters in Battle Creek, and so now there's kind of a Seventh-Day Adventist museum in Battle Creek, kind of an Adventist version of Greenfield Village, a bunch of buildings that are important to Adventism, all congregated into a little village. Been there many years ago, but I'm excited to go back again, see the Historic Adventist Village, and take you guys along too with this video camera. So you might see a few other cool spots in Battle Creek, but yeah, come along with us as we visit the Historic Adventist Village in Battle Creek, Michigan. Well, here we are at the Historic Adventist Village. I'm really excited about being able to go take this tour here. So yeah, come along with me as we take a tour of the Historic Adventist Village and learn some awesome history.
As Advent Town. The majority of the people that lived on this west end of Battle Creek at that time were Seventh-Day Adventists. Now that could have been 6 out of 10 families, but it still made them the majority. Now that White House with the green on it, that's a house that Willie White bought in 1891. Well, Willie really never lived here because it was in 1891 that his mother was sent to Australia. Because Willie was her caretaker, he went to Australia with her. But his 2 daughters from his first marriage, to Mary Kelsey, who eventually died of tuberculosis, they lived in that house there with the caretaker until Willie remarried in Australia, and then he sent for them. So because Willie's 2 daughters lived in that house, it makes it so there was 4 generations of whites that lived on this road here. Willie's 2 daughters lived in that house. Right directly across the road there, James Ellen White and the 4 boys lived in that house. And then just this side of the house was John and Betsy White, who were James White's parents. There's no other place in the world that can make that claim. So we think we have kind of a special place right here. Yeah. Now when the village started, there was actually a house that was sitting right here. This house was in really bad shape. And they thought that this house next door was John Loughborough's house. So they allowed this house to be torn down. After the house was down, they checked their paperwork. Found out they tore down the wrong house. You know, have you ever heard that statement, measure twice, cut once? This should have been check deed twice, tear down the house once. And that's why we don't have John and Mary's loft here. House. It says future exhibit, but I think we're going to be in heaven before that happens. But John Loughborough is one of my favorite pioneers I talk about here in the village, because John Loughborough became an Adventist minister when he was 16 years old. But he was not a Sabbatarian Adventist, because the year was 1848. He was a Millerite Adventist, or a First-Day Adventist. Well, in the winter of his 17th birthday, he decided he really wanted to be an evangelist. But he did not want to be an evangelist around where he lived, because he thought, you know, if I fail, my friends are going to laugh at me. So with $4 in his pocket, a pair of pants that had been 7 inches too long, so they'd cut them off. So chances are they're a little wider on the waist yet. And a coat without a lining. He headed for Rochester, New York between Christmas and New Year's 1848. Well, he spent the first night in Rochester, and the next day he decided I really need to go find a building to preach at. Well, he got about 12 miles away from there, and he found a Baptist church. And that Baptist minister thought, you know, this kid can preach here. What harm is he going to do? He's only a 16-year-old boy. Well, that first night, that church was packed, because everybody wanted to see this 16-year-old boy without any facial hair preach. And John says he wasn't nervous at all, but then maybe he didn't know there were 7 ministers in the audience that night either. Well, the second night, the church is packed again. And by this time, this minister is thinking, all right, there's some substance to this John Loughborough. I'm going to lose my congregation unless I shut him down. So at the end of the service, he stands up and he says, John, I'm so sorry you're not going to be able to preach here tomorrow night. We're going to have choir practice in here. Well, everybody could see right through that story. So a man by the name of Mr. Thompson stands up and he said, John, there's no choir practice in here tomorrow night. This minister is just afraid of what you're preaching. Now he says, I have a schoolhouse 5 miles from here. You can come preach there, and you can live at my house. Well, that was fine with John. He said, just tell everybody where I'll be tomorrow night. Well, that next day, that Baptist minister wasn't done with John yet, so he had some of his members invite him over for lunch. And when John showed up and sat down at the table, in come walking that Baptist minister too. And he says to John, that was quite an attendance you had last night. John says, yeah, I had a pretty good crowd. But he says, am I to understand correctly now that you're preaching that man is mortal, that he goes right to the grave? John says, well, I don't know how you could take it any other way. I preached it right from the Bible. Well, this minister says, well, in Revelation 25, it says man goes directly to heaven. Well, John thinks about that for a second. There's only 22 chapters in that book of Revelation. So he finally says to this minister, well, that's 3 chapters outside the Bible. The minister takes John's Bible from him and he starts looking for Revelation 25. Finally looks up and he says, where's Revelation? Well, John takes his Bible back. First shows him that there's only 22 chapters in there. And then also tells him that, you know, Revelation is in the New Testament, not the Old Testament, where he was looking. Well, by this time, this Baptist minister, everybody in this house knows that he doesn't know his Bible very well. And he also knows that his time here at that house is done. So he just finally says, you know, I have more important things to do than to stand here and argue with you, John. And he left. Well, John did have 5 sermons in that schoolhouse. That's all he had. He was only a 16-year-old boy. Well, when John and Mary lived here, though, they had a really rough lifestyle. Back in those days, preachers did not get a salary. They just got paid whatever a church would give them. So here, they had their own gardens, they had their own orchards, they made their own soap, they canned their own fruits and vegetables, but in their personal life, they had it even tougher. You see, they had a 2-year-old daughter, Teresa, that died. And then they had a 6-day-old daughter, Minnie, that died. Remember that 39.9 years life expectancy? That was the average age back in those days, 39.9 years. And that was because so many babies died. Well, then Mary became pregnant with twins, which should have been a happy time, except for one of those was born dead, and then Mary died within the hour also. So if you go to Oak Hill Cemetery, a 1.5 miles from here, and you find Mary Loughborough's grave, that baby's buried in her arms, so in resurrection morning, she can carry that baby to heaven with her. Because we do have hope in a resurrection.
Amen.
All right, now as I said, originally they thought this house was John Loughborough's house. We call it our William J. Hardy exhibit. Well, William J. Hardy didn't live here either. The lady that did live here, though, does have kind of an interesting story. Her name was Harriet Henderson Tucker. And Harriet Henderson Tucker came north on the Underground Railroad when she was 2 years old in her daddy's arms. Yes, she was a runaway slave. Now, back in the 1800s, they had slavery here in the United States. The free states were north. Slavery existed in the south. The Underground Railroad was the series of safe houses from slavery in the south to freedom in Canada in the north. Well, Battle Creek was a huge stop on this railroad. There was a man by the name of Erastus Hussey. He was a Quaker, and he himself knows that he brought over 1,000 slaves through here and sent them on to Canada. Mrs. Tucker's dad thought that Battle Creek was safe enough, though, so they sat down roots here. Now, Mrs. Tucker, who lived here, nor her daughter, who lived across the road, ever became Seventh-Day Adventists, but out of respect for the other Adventists here in Advent Town, they would not do their laundry on Saturday and hang it out on the clothesline. We're going to this one. Now that placard right behind us, in 1850 they enacted a law here in the United States. It was called the Fugitive Slave Law. That said that if you found a runaway slave, even in the free states of the North, you were required by the federal government of the United States to send them back to their masters. The only time we know of Mrs. White ever speaking against the federal government was when she said, no man should own another person, don't send them back. And that's what that deals with. Now Henry Box Brown here, I'll let you look him up on the internet. He never became a Seventh-Day Adventist. He does have an interesting story how he escaped slavery, but it's a story we tell to the public school system when they come through here because we have to be just a little more gentle with our stories with them or we lose them. Charles Keaney. Now Charles Keaney was the first black SDA ordained minister. Now he was born into slavery. After the Civil War he got a little bit of education. He also took some barbering. And then he hooked up with the wagon train and headed out west. Well, he got as far as Reno, Nevada and decided this is where I'm going to spend the rest of my life. Well, John Loughborough and Emma White came through there holding evangelistic meetings. Charles Keaney and 6 others were converted to the Seventh-day Sabbath. Well, now after his conversion, Nevada didn't have a conference back in those days. They were underneath the California conference. So he was elected church clerk, and he was to send all of his paperwork on to California. Well, he was so meticulous in what he was doing that they decided this man needs to be a Seventh-day Adventist minister, so they sponsored him to Hellsburg College out in California, where he did become an Adventist minister. Now, one time, Charles Keaney was the only Seventh-day Adventist minister in the whole United States evangelizing all the blacks in the United States. So he had a huge mission field, and I'll tell you about his help later on. Now, there's 2 men that received visions before Ellen White did. First one was a black man by the name of William Boyd. Now, he was a free-will Baptist minister. He lived up in Boston, Massachusetts, which was a free state. Now, even though he wasn't a slave, and he lived in a free state, they still weren't free, because they had to be very careful of what they did and said. As I referred to them, they were black men in a white man's world. Well, his first vision was in January of 1842. It was 2.5 hours long. He didn't think anybody would listen to it, so he didn't go publish it from the pulpits. His second vision 1 month later was 12.5 hours long. Now, the longest one Ellen White ever had was 4 hours. After the second vision, though, the angel told him he was to publish this vision, or tell it. Well, it was only a month after the first one. He didn't think anybody had listened to it yet, but his fellow ministers encouraged him to preach it from their pulpits. And when he did, he was universally accepted by both blacks and whites, because the message was from the Lord. But after 3 months, he couldn't afford to live on what the churches were giving him, because, like John Loughborough, he didn't get a salary. So he went back to farming. He had 2 more visions, but eventually he lost those visions. In 1845, though, he heard a young girl by the name of Ellen Harmon revealing the same visions that he did. He got so excited, he jumped up in the middle of the service, shouted hallelujah, and encouraged her to continue to pursue those visions, which obviously she did. Incidentally, the second man to receive visions was a man by the name of Hazen Foss. Hazen Foss was actually related to Ellen White. Her older sister had married a man by the name of Samuel Foss. Samuel and Hazen were brothers. So was their brother-in-law's brother. Hazen Foss refused to reveal the visions until they were taken from him, and he himself says he's a lost man because of it, because he rejected the Holy Spirit. Lottie Blake, first black female SDA physician. Kind of an interesting story, but I'd rather go to Ann Knight, my second favorite pioneer here in the village. Now, Ann Knight was born after the Civil War, so she was born as a freed person. But the way to keep the blacks down after the Civil War was not to educate them. If a person can't read, write, add, and subtract, you can tell them anything's on a piece of paper. They have to believe you, because they don't know any difference. That didn't work for Ann Knight. She wanted an education. So she traded her ability to do housework with a friend, if that friend would teach her how to read and write. Well, after she learned how to read, she needed some books and magazines. So a salesman came through town, and for $1 she could get subscriptions. So she begged $1 off her mother. Her mother says, don't ever do this again, because this is foolish money spent. And she sent away for these catalogs and magazines. Well, one of the magazines she got was called the Comfort Magazine. And in there they had what was called a Cousin's Corner, where people could write in and have their wishes granted. Well, Anna's wish was for pen pals, and soon it was granted, because she had 40 pen pals. At one time in Gitmo, Mississippi, she got more mail than everybody else in the whole postal district combined. 2 of those pen pals were Seventh-day Adventists. One was an evangelist, or excuse me, was a colporteur from the state of Texas. The other was a lady that worked for the Signs of the Times out in California called Edith Embray. Now, Edith, when she'd send the Signs of the Times to Anna, she'd do something rather strange. She'd put a red check or a blue check in the magazine. And then with the accompanying letter, she'd say, Anna, when you read the article with a red check, or you read the article with a blue check, please write back and tell me what you think about it. This caused Anna to have to do 3 things. She had to read that article, she had to think about that article, and then she had to write back about that article. Within 6 months, she was convicted of the Seventh-day Sabbath. Well, where she lived, there were no other Sabbath keepers. Well, Edith had also to introduce to a family called the Chambers, who lived in a place called Chattanooga, Tennessee. Well, the Chambers, they invited Anna, if she wanted to be baptized, to come to Chattanooga, and they would baptize her there. I say that because they're from Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so Anna sold her half of a bale of cotton. She bought a train ticket to Chattanooga, Tennessee, 383 miles away, and was baptized into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now she decided she wanted some education, though. So they enrolled her in Graysville Academy, which was a forerunner to Southern University. Well, Anna went to classes in the morning, but by noon the people of Graysville had heard that there was a black girl in school. They put up such a fuss that she wasn't even allowed to finish the day off in school. Fortunately, though, Anna was living with the matron of the school, so she did get 10 weeks of schooling before she went back to Gitmo, Mississippi, as she says, a dyed-in-the-wool Seventh-Day Adventist. But now she ran into a dilemma. You see, she had to decide whether she was going to keep the 4th commandment or the 5th commandment, because her mother said education had made her stupid and lazy. Stupid because she changed the day she worshipped on, lazy because she wasn't working Saturdays anymore. Well, Anna, she decided to stick by her guns, literally. So on Saturday morning, she'd take her youth instructor, her Review and Herald, her Bible, and her revolver, and she'd go out in the woods to worship. She let people know she knew how to use all 4 of those items very well, thinking in case trouble should show up. Well, eventually, though, the trouble at home became so great, she made her way up to Mount Vernon Academy in Ohio for a year, and then up here to Battle Creek to take the missionary nurses training course. Now, after she had taken that course and was just about ready to graduate, Dr. Kellogg challenged these nurses to become missionaries where they lived. So she went back to Gitmo, Mississippi. This time the family was a little more accepting. So she started a school. She started Sabbath schools. She started Sunday schools. She started medical work. She started teaching about the dangers of moonshine. Pretty soon, the General Conference up here in Battle Creek is hearing about this dynamo by the name of Anna Knight that's doing all these wonderful programs down there. So they invited her to come back to the 1901 General Conference. When she got back here, she found out they were looking for missionaries to India. Oh, Anna had always wanted to be a foreign missionary. So she said to the General Conference, if you can find 2 people to take my place in Mississippi, because one person can't do everything I was doing, I will go to India as a missionary. Well, they found a young couple. So Anna did go to India for 6.5 years. Here again, she was Miss Everything. If that school needed a principal, it was Anna Knight. If it needed a treasurer, it was Anna Knight. If it needed a home ec teacher, it was Anna Knight. If they needed somebody to plow the gardens with the American plow, once again, that was Anna Knight. And in her spare time, she also did coat ring work. But after 6.5 years, she heard that that young couple couldn't keep those programs going and they were starting to close. So she asked for a furlough to come back to the United States and restart those programs. When she got back here, she found out that they were just then starting the Southern Conferences. So they would ask Anna to take positions in education and health. As long as they were in those 2 fields, Anna would accept it. From 1911 until 1952, she kept track of every mile she traveled for the Seventh-Day Adventist Church. Wow. It was 554,000 miles. Wow. That is the equivalent of 23 times around the world. That didn't include her journeys to India and back. She also kept track of every book, or every letter she ever wrote, every meeting she ever attended, and every Bible study she ever gave. Wow. If you ever find the book, Mississippi Girl, Anna Knight's autobiography, I highly recommend you read it. It has been out of print since 1952. We are actually trying to get it back into print, but we're having some tail dragging by the people that own the rights to the book. So, all right, Mississippi, the Morning Star. Now, as I said, at one time Charles Keaney was the only Adventist minister evangelizing all the blacks in the United States. Well, Edson and Emma, they had kind of strayed from the Adventist church for a while. Edson was the 2nd son of James and Ellen White. When they came back, they read Mrs. White's article, Our Duty to the Colored People, and they decided we can help. Now, even though the Civil War had been over for many years, they knew that if they brought a tent down there, it'd probably get torn down. If they built a building down there, it'd probably get burned down. So their idea was, let's build a boat and we'll put it on the Mississippi River. That way we can pull up to the riverbank, we can put the gangplank down, people can get aboard this boat for education or evangelism. If trouble shows up, we just pick up the gangplank, we sail up and down the river until the trouble's gone, we have the people off. It was a great idea. They only had one problem with their idea. They wanted to build this boat here in Battle Creek, Michigan. Well, I don't know if you remember coming across the Kalamazoo River this morning, or this afternoon, or when you ever came. Well, my wife and I kayaked yesterday. We hit bottom a lot of times. This boat they were going to build was 12 feet wide, 72 feet long. There's no way it would float on the Kalamazoo River here. So what they did is they built parts of the boat here in Battle Creek, and then they sent it by ox cart down to a town called Allegan. There the river was deeper and wider, and 4 members of the Allegan church volunteered to put this boat together. From there it sailed under its own power down to a town called Saugatuck, Michigan. Now Saugatuck, Michigan is right about there on the Michigan Hand. Andrews University is right about there. Saugatuck had a harbor on the inland ocean. Well, nowadays we call it Lake Michigan. From there, though, it had to get over Chicago, go through the canal system, which would get it to the Illinois River, which would get it to the Mississippi. Well, this is a riverboat. It's not made for the Great Lakes. So they hired a towboat called the Bonamie to help them across. They had a 200-foot cable between the 2 boats, and they started across Lake Michigan for Chicago. About halfway across the lake, a violent storm hit. Now, Emma, who was on the Bonamie with the captain, thought she'd never see her husband ever again. The storm was that fierce. The captain of the Bonamine, he wasn't so sure anybody'd see land ever again. The storm was that fierce. When they finally did arrive in Chicago 5 hours late, this captain was so impressed, he said, surely this is the Lord's boat. And he gave him $10 as a donation. Well, they spent a couple of days in Chicago, both to repair the boat and to get over their seasickness. And then they went down through the canal system. They went down the Illinois River. They got as far as Cairo, Illinois on the Mississippi River, and then they stopped to do more work on the boat. Well, when they went to leave, though, on the Mississippi River, you have to have a riverboat pilot. And try as they might, looking all over town, they couldn't find one. So finally, a recent convert, a black teenager by the name of Finis Parker, agreed to help them look for somebody for 1 week. And after they hadn't found one, they hired Finis to bring them down the river. And he did know the river very well. The only problem was that back in those days, there were no black riverboat pilots. So as Finis would be behind the wheel and the boat would be going down river, a boat would start coming up river, he'd have to duck down, the white man would take the wheel until the two boats passed. Well, by the time they got down to Tennessee, word had gotten ahead of them and initially cost them a $500 fine, but they did get that rescinded. Now the boat worked on the Yazoo and the Mississippi River from 1894 to 1896. It worked so well that they expanded the boat to 24 feet wide, 107 feet long. They added another deck to it. It had printing presses, classrooms, staff housing, and an evangelism center for over 200 people. They continued to work on the Yazoo, the Mississippi, and the Columbine River that goes up into Nashville or Memphis?
Cumberland.
Cumberland, is that what it is?
Yeah, Cumberland.
Worked on those rivers until 1904 when Edson and Emma had malaria so many times, they finally beached the boat, and in 1906 the boat burned. Now the boilers from the Morning Star went to Riverside Sanitarium in Tennessee. The Bell and the Star went to Oakwood Industrial School in Alabama, because many of the first students that went to Oakwood Industrial School were students that had come off the Morning Star. All right, one more story in here, and then we'll go into an air-conditioned school and we can sit down. Escuela. Use my Spanish and my Escuela. Now this table here, this is set to represent the table of the William J. Hardy family. Now the William J. Hardy family lived about 40 miles north of here in a town called Caledonia. And as far as we know, the William J. Hardy family was the first black Seventh-Day Adventist family anywhere in the world. But now William J. himself would not have been the first black Seventh-Day Adventist, because we know the evangelist had to spend a couple of extra nights after his wife Eliza had been baptized. Now, even though the Hardy family lived in what was considered the free north at that time, it still was not considered acceptable for white people and black people to sit down at the table to eat together. But Ellen White said, you know, if we can't eat together here on earth, we're never going to eat together in heaven. So whenever the whites would make a trip to their northern churches, the Hardy home was kind of a midway point, and so they'd stop there knowing they were going to get a Hardy meal. All right, somebody caught. Somebody caught. All right.
Oh yeah, right away. I love it.
Now, William J. Hardy, who we have the picture of right there, he was also the first black elected official in the state of Michigan. In 1872, he was elected Gaines Township supervisor, and his son Eugene was the first black high school graduate in the state of Michigan. So up near Grand Rapids, where Caledonia was, the Hardy family was very well known for their politics, their religion, and their education. All right, we'll go through the back room here. Now this stove here, this is from that time period, and what's kind of unique about this stove is that it has a reservoir on the side of it. When you started your meal, you'd fill that with cold water. By the time your meal was done, your hot water for your dishes was done also. It also had this handy little warmer here, that if Dad was still working out in the field and the family ate, they could put his food up here and keep it warm. Now that picture on the wall there, that is a picture that somebody did for us of Anna Knight, that first black missionary to India. She was not only the first black Seventh-Day Adventist missionary, she was the first black of any religion to go to India as a missionary nurse. And as you see, she died in 1972, not that long ago. Up behind you here, we have a copy of her graduation certificate from the Battle Creek Training School for Missionary Nurses. On the second shelf there, we have the blouse that she was wearing when that picture was done. On the third shelf to the left is Anna Knight with her students in Gitmo, Mississippi. And on the right is Anna Knight at the 1901 General Conference. And then on the top shelf here, we have a picture of Anna Knight when she went to school here in Battle Creek. Now, Anna Knight never did get married. Her missionary was her life. Alright, we're going to head to that escuela right there, and we'll go right up there to that porch right there at the head of the ranch.